Hi everybody, thanks for joining us today for another Facebook Live event with Americans for Prosperity. I'm Chrissy Harbin, and I am thrilled to be here on Capitol Hill with someone who is leading the charge on fixing our nation's broken banking laws. Congressman Jeb Hensarling chairs the House Financial Services Committee, and he's a longtime friend of Americans for Prosperity. Thank you for being here today.
Oh, listen, happy to do it. Happy to do it for everybody who belongs to AFP.
Thank you for joining us for this important conversation. Tell us a little bit more about this important legislation that you're sponsoring. I know that there has been a lot of activity here in the House on fixing a lot of these Dodd-Frank laws. Tell us a little bit more about why this legislation is needed.
Well, it's so important because Dodd-Frank essentially broke all of its promises to the American people. It actually had nothing to do with the financial crisis, which had everything to do with Fannie and Freddie and public policy in sending banks to loan money to people to buy homes that they couldn't afford to keep. And so Dodd-Frank made several promises to the American people. It promised that it would lift the economy, but instead we're stuck in the slowest, weakest recovery in the post-war era. 1.5% to 2% economic growth is unacceptable. It promised that it would end too big to fail, but cynically it codified it into law. It creates a whole system of designating banks as too big to fail and then puts behind it a taxpayer-funded bailout fund. Dodd-Frank promised it would make the economy more stable, but the big banks are bigger. Right. The small banks are fewer. We're losing a small bank or credit union a day. Finally, Dodd-Frank promised that it would help the consumer, but guess what? Since Dodd-Frank became law, free checking's been cut in half, bank fees have gone up, credit cards are fewer, they're more expensive. Mortgages, they're harder to come by, costing hundreds and hundreds of dollars more. And then, pernicious to our own economic liberty, we now have Washington bureaucrats who are unelected, unaccountable, basically now having the power to choose our credit cards for us, our mortgages for us. That's just wrong in the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's really concerning to see that growth in government responding to the financial crisis and have a lot of direct and significant impacts on grassroots activists' lives.
Well, and indeed, Dodd-Frank represents a greater imposition of regulation on our economy than all Obama-era regulations combined. It is that bad. And so thus we've introduced the Financial Choice Act that's going to be replacing bailouts with bankruptcy. It's going to be replacing regulatory micromanagement with freedom and market discipline. It's going to be replacing bailout with bankruptcy. It's going to be replacing complexity with simplicity, because complexity can be gamed by the Wall Street well-to-do and frankly abused by the Washington elite.
Well, we've been strong supporters of your legislation off the Hill.
I know.
Earlier this year, AFP led a coalition letter of over 20 organizations and expressing support for the Choice Act. Tell us a little bit more about some of the other important changes that it does, in particular the CFPB. I think those are the most significant.
Well, many people don't know it, but the Orwellian name CFPB is perhaps the single most powerful, unaccountable federal agency in the history of our republic. To the best of my knowledge, it is only one of two federal agencies that any court has held unconstitutional since the New Deal. It is that bad. And so one unaccountable, one unelected individual can determine essentially any financial product is quote-unquote abusive, whatever that means, which means it's totally within his discretion, and he can essentially decide whether or not we get a credit card, whether we get a mortgage, whether we get a bank account. Again, that's something that you might expect to see in the old Soviet Union. It's not something you'd expect to see in the United States of America. So the Financial Choice Act replaces it with something called the Consumer Law Enforcement Agency that is there to not make up the law, but enforce the law. And also, the best form of consumer protection has always been a competitive, transparent, innovative marketplace that's vigorously policed for force and fraud. And so that's our vision of what consumer protection is all about.
That's excellent. So we're hearing, I know it's a really busy day here on the House side. I know there's a lot going on. How soon do you think we'll see some future action on your important legislation?
Well, let me check my watch. I'm predicting tomorrow. It will be on the floor tomorrow, and I'm expecting that we will have a victorious vote at the end of the day. send it to the Senate and start pushing from there.
That's excellent. AFP is going to score in support of the important
Excellent.
legislation, so we'll be able to highlight how members stand on the important issue of fixing our nation's broken banking laws. So thank you so much, Congressman, for being here with us today and for
Anytime.
everything you're doing on banking reform.